Hello, and thank you for being here tonight. Come in, get comfortable, let the rest of the evening fall away for a while. Tonight we go back further than most stories dare to go back before writing, before cities, before anyone had ever planted a seed on purpose and waited for it to grow. Tonight we go back to a time when getting food was not a chore, it was a wager, and the stakes were your life. For most of the time humans have existed on this earth, there was no guarantee of the next meal. There was no field, no herd penned and waiting, no granary to fall back on when luck ran short. There was only the hunt, and the hunt did not forgive mistakes. A single afternoon could feed a family for weeks, or it could end that family's story altogether. Miss once at the wrong moment against the wrong animal, and hunger was not the only thing waiting on the other side. Sometimes it was your own death. Picture a man crouched low in tall grass somewhere on a wide plain that no longer exists in the shape it once had tens of thousands of years ago. His name is lost to us as almost all their names are, but his body will not be lost. Long after he is gone, the ground will keep it, and it will tell us things he never wrote down. Right now, though, he is simply cold and still and waiting. His breath moves in slow clouds. Ahead of him a herd grazes unaware, and somewhere beside him, close enough to touch a boy who is not yet a man, watches him for a signal. This is the boy's first real hunt. Everything the boy knows about survival he has learned by watching this exact stillness. The man lifts 2 fingers barely. The boy understands. They wait a little longer because waiting is often the difference between eating and not eating, between walking home and not walking home at all. What is remarkable is not that this moment is dramatic. It is not in the way we are used to. There is no music underneath it, no rising tension built for an audience. It is simply true, repeated an uncountable number of times in an uncountable number of places, by people whose entire understanding of the world rested on getting this exact moment right. And what should strike us lying here now, with our own lives so far removed from that grass and that cold, is how much of what we still are was built inside moments exactly like this one. Our patience, our caution, our instinct to read the room before we act. All of it has roots here in a world where a wrong decision did not mean an awkward conversation or a difficult meeting. It meant a spear that did not land in time, an animal that turned instead of running, a body carried home instead of walking home on its own. This is not a story about a single hunter or a single hunt. It is the story of an era hundreds of thousands of years long, when nearly every human being who ever lived carried this same quiet arithmetic in the back of their mind. What is the risk today? What do we need? What are we willing to gamble to get it? It shaped what people ate, who they trusted, how they raised their children, and even we are starting to understand how the human body itself came to be built. The bones from this era still carry the evidence, healed breaks in places no accident could easily explain wear patterns that only come from a very particular kind of labour, done over and over for an entire life. Scholars still debate exactly how dangerous any single hunt truly was on average, since the evidence that survives can only tell us so much about the vast majority of hunts that ended without incident. But what does survive tells us plainly that danger was not the exception. It was the baseline. It was simply what living looked like. Before we go further into that world, I wanted to pause for just a moment the way I do at the start of every one of these evenings. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the real story told slowly without anyone shouting for your attention, it helps enormously if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you would like more evenings like this one. I would also love to know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and what it was about this particular story that pulled you in. I read every one, even the ones that come in long after I have posted them. Now let the rest of the world go quiet for a little while, and let's begin properly. Long before there were names for continents, Humans were already spread across most of them in small mobile bands, rarely larger than a few dozen people. There was no fixed home in the way we understand the word. Home was wherever the animals were, wherever the water had not yet run dry, wherever the last good shelter still held against the wind. A band might move a handful of times in a single year, following herds the way a shadow follows its source, always a step behind, always adjusting. Everything about daily existence bent around this one central fact that food had to be found or killed nearly every single day, because there was rarely a way to store enough of it to stop thinking about tomorrow. Plants were gathered with real skill roots dug at exactly the right season seeds, and nuts collected and processed in ways that took real knowledge to get right. But it was the meat, the fat, the marrow from a large animal that could change everything at once. A successful hunt did not just feed a family for an evening. It could feed an entire band for days, sometimes longer, freeing hands and attention for everything else that needed doing. Tools repaired, children taught, stories passed, down around a fire. That was itself one of the great turning points in this whole human story. But that abundance came at a price that never fully went away. To bring down an animal many times a human's size and strength with only a sharpened stone and a length of wood required something between skill and faith. It required tracking an animal for hours, sometimes days, reading its trail, understanding its habits well enough to predict where it would be before it got there. It required getting close enough to strike, which meant getting close enough to be struck back. And it required knowing every single time that the animal on the other end of that spear had every reason in the world to fight for its life and every capability to end yours in the process. This was the wager that shaped an era. Not a single dramatic moment, but millions of ordinary ones, each one carrying the same quiet possibility underneath it that today might be the day it goes wrong. And it is inside that possibility repeated across hundreds of thousands of years that we begin to understand not just how our ancestors survived, but how they became slowly, unmistakably us. Consider what it actually meant to fail. Not in the abstract, not as a statistic, but in the plain physical terms of a single evening. A band returns to camp with empty hands, no meat slung over a shoulder, no fresh skins to work, nothing but the same berries and roots that had already been thinned out over the past several days of foraging in the same stretch of ground. Children are watching faces to read what tomorrow will feel like the way children always have before they understand the words for hunger or scarcity. The adults know something the children do not yet fully grasp, that a single missed hunt rarely kills anyone by itself. It is the second miss and the third stacked close together that turns a bad week into something far more dangerous. Fat reserves the human body can call on in short bursts begin to run thin. Judgment grows careless in exactly the moments it needs to be sharpest. A hungry hunter takes worse risks, moves a little slower, reacts a little later, and the margin that once separated a difficult hunt from a fatal one narrows without anyone deciding it should. This is the quiet engine running underneath nearly every decision these bands made. Not fear in the dramatic sense, but a constant practical awareness that the gap between having enough and having nothing at all was never very wide. It shaped where people chose to sleep, how far they were willing to travel in a single day, and how carefully they weighed a promising trail against the fading light of an afternoon. Waiting one more hour for a better shot at a larger animal might mean walking home in darkness through territory shared with predators who had their own hungry calculations to make. Turning back too early might mean another night with nothing. There was rarely a version of this choice that carried no risk at all. There was only the version that seemed in that particular moment slightly less dangerous than the alternative. What is easy to miss looking back from where we sit now, warm and fed, and rarely more than a short walk from something to eat, is how much cooperation this constant pressure actually produced, rather than the kind of desperate competition we might expect. Sharing meat after a successful hunt was not simply generosity. In many of these bands, it appears to have functioned as something closer to insurance. The hunter who brought down a large animal today could not eat all of it before it spoiled, and he knew with total certainty that his own luck would eventually run out on some future afternoon. Sharing widely evenly without keeping score too closely meant that when his turn to fail arrived, and it always did eventually arrive, others would share back with him. Anthropologists studying hunting societies that persisted into the modern era in places like the Kalahari and the Arctic have observed exactly this pattern, meat divided according to custom rather than to who threw the spear that landed, because the group's survival depended on smoothing out the unevenness of individual fortune over time. It is a strange thing to sit with that some of the earliest human generosity we can trace was built not from soft sentiment, but from a hard, practical understanding of how thin the line was between feast and hunger for absolutely everyone. The evidence for how seriously our ancestors took this arithmetic shows up in places you might not expect to look. Teeth, more than almost anything else, hold a kind of diary written by the body itself. Growth lines in tooth enamel can reveal periods of real nutritional stress, stretching back tens of thousands of years. Faint bands laid down during weeks when the body was pulling resources away from growth just to keep itself running. Reading these bands in ancient remains, researchers have found repeated episodes of hardship, even among groups that by other measures appear to have been thriving. It suggests something worth sitting with quietly for a moment, that even in bands who are on the whole skilled and successful hunters, hunger was never truly a stranger. It was simply a visitor who came and went, sometimes for a season, sometimes for only a handful of difficult days, but who never left permanently, no matter how good the hunting had been the year before. There is still real debate among researchers about how often true prolonged famine struck these groups, as opposed to the shorter, sharper stretches of scarcity that seem to appear far more frequently in the evidence. The physical record is by its nature incomplete. Bones and teeth can tell us that stress occurred, but they cannot always tell us exactly how long it lasted, or how close to genuine starvation any particular band actually came before conditions improved again. What most researchers do agree on is that mobility itself, the willingness to simply walk away from a place that had stopped providing and toward one that might, was very likely the single greatest tool these bands had against sustained hunger. Staying too long in one place out of comfort or exhaustion appears to have been one of the more dangerous choices a band could make, even more dangerous in the long run than the hunt itself. And this is where something quietly remarkable comes into focus if you sit with it for a moment the way I am asking you to now. The instinct many of us still carry today, the discomfort, with an empty pantry, the small anxious pull toward checking that there is still enough, the deep satisfaction of a shared meal among people we trust, none of that appeared recently. It was not invented by any particular culture or any particular century. It was carried forward generation after generation from exactly this world, a world where missing once did not simply mean disappointment. It meant a countdown had quietly begun, one that either ended with a successful hunt in the days that followed or did not end well at all. The man and the boy from the tall grass, the ones we sat with a little while ago, were not simply hunting an animal that evening. They were hunting against that countdown, against the slow arithmetic of hunger that every single person in their band was carrying somewhere in the back of their mind, whether they spoke of it aloud or not. And as the light continued to fade over that ancient plain, as the herd grew closer, and the moment for the spear drew nearer, there was one more factor working against them that neither of them could fully control, something built into the very animal they were tracking. A kind of danger that had nothing to do with hunger at all, and everything to do with what happens when the hunted decides all at once to stop running. What made the difference between a hunter who grew old and one who did not was rarely raw strength. Strength mattered certainly, but strength alone has never been enough to bring down an animal built to outrun, outweigh, or simply outlast a human being. The real skill, the one that took an entire childhood to build and an entire lifetime to refine, was something closer to fluency. Fluency in an animal's habits, its fears, its patterns of movement across a landscape that to an untrained eye would have looked like nothing more than empty grass and scattered trees. A child growing up in one of these bands did not learn to hunt the way we might imagine through some formal lesson or a single dramatic rite of passage. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, the way a person absorbs a language simply by hearing it spoken around them every day of their life. Long before a child ever held a spear with any real intention, they were already learning to read the ground. A bent blade of grass meant something had passed recently. A scattering of droppings told you not just what animal had been there, but roughly how long ago, and sometimes even how anxious or relaxed it had been while it passed. The angle of a broken twig could tell you whether an animal had walked through calmly or bolted in fear as any experienced hunter understood spreads. If one animal in a herd had been startled recently, the entire herd would be more alert for hours afterward, and a hunt attempted during that window was a hunt made far more dangerous than it needed to be. This kind of knowledge rewards patience in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. Hunters in many of these bands were capable of tracking a single animal for the better part of a day, sometimes longer, not through seed but through a kind of quiet, accumulating certainty. Every print, every disturbed patch of soil, every place where the animal had paused to graze or drink added one more piece to a picture that was slowly forming in the hunter's mind, not just of where the animal was, but of what it was likely to do next. There is a particular technique still practiced today by a small number of hunting communities in southern Africa, sometimes called persistence hunting, where a hunter does not attempt to outrun an animal at all, but simply keeps it moving hour after hour in the heat of the day until the animal's own body temperature rises past what it can manage and it can go no further. Researchers who have studied this practice believe it may represent one of the oldest hunting strategies our species ever developed, one that relies on nothing more than endurance, water discipline, and an intimate understanding of how a particular animal's body responds to sustained heat. It requires almost no weaponry at all. It requires knowledge and the discipline to trust that knowledge, even as the animal disappears from view, again and again over the course of many hours. What is easy to overlook sitting comfortably as we are now is how much of this knowledge lived nowhere except inside a person's memory. There were no written guides to consult, no diagrams passed hand to hand. Everything a band knew about the animals sharing their landscape, their breeding seasons, their favoured watering places, the subtle signs that separated a herd at rest from a herd about to bolt existed only in the accumulated experience of the people who had watched and remembered and passed that watching down. An older hunter was not simply a person who had lived a long time. He or she was quite literally a walking record of decades of observation that the entire band depended on. When that person died, some portion of that knowledge died with them, unless it had already been carefully, patiently transferred to someone younger. This may be part of why so many hunting societies, both ancient and those that persisted into recent centuries, treated their elders with a particular kind of reverence that had very little to do with sentiment and a great deal to do with plain necessity. An elder was infrastructure in a world that had no other way to store what had been learned. There is a detail here that surprises most people the first time they encounter it, because it runs against the picture many of us carry from old textbooks and museum dioramas of the solitary hunter creeping alone through the wilderness. In practice, a great many hunts, particularly hunts aimed at genuinely large or dangerous animals, were group efforts coordinated with a level of planning that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. Archaeological sites across parts of Europe and North America have revealed what researchers call kill sites, locations where the arrangement of bones and stone tools suggests that entire herds, and sometimes numbering in the dozens, were deliberately driven toward a natural feature, a narrow ravine, a soft bog, occasionally the edge of a cliff, where the terrain itself became a weapon far more effective than any spear. This required something remarkable, not just physical courage, but genuine coordination among many people at once, an understanding of the landscape precise enough to know exactly where a running herd could be pushed, and enough trust between hunters that each person could rely on the others to hold their position at exactly the right moment. Scholars still debate how much of this coordination was planned in advance in the way we might plan a modern operation, versus how much depended on instinct and adaptation in the moment, since the physical evidence can show us the outcome of these hunts far more clearly than it can show us the conversations that must have preceded them. What these mass hunts also reveal, and this is the detail that tends to sit with people longest, is scale. A single successful drive of this kind could yield far more meat than any one family could possibly use, more than could even be shared fairly among a single band before it's spoiled. This suggests that on the rare occasions when such large hunts succeeded, multiple bands may have gathered together, temporarily setting aside whatever territorial boundaries usually kept them apart in order to share in an abundance too large for any one group to manage alone. For people who lived most of their lives in units of a few dozen at most, these gatherings would have been rare and significant events. Moments when a much wider human world became briefly visible, when stories and marriages and knowledge about distant grounds could pass between bands that otherwise rarely crossed paths. It is a strange thought to sit with in the quiet of an evening like this one, that some of the earliest large human gatherings we have evidence for may have been made possible not by peace or ceremony alone, but by the successful coordinated killing of an enormous number of animals in a single carefully executed afternoon. None of this made the underlying danger disappear. Reading an animal correctly told a hunter a great deal about probability, about where an encounter was likely to happen and how it was likely to unfold. But probability is not certainty, and every hunter who ever lived by this knowledge also understood somewhere underneath the confidence that experience gave them that the animal in front of them had not read the same signs. It had not agreed to the outcome the hunter believed was coming. It simply reacted the way animals always have to pain, to fear, to the sudden nearness of something that meant it harm. And there was one category of anima in particular among all the creatures these hunters tracked and studied and came to know so intimately that carried a kind of danger no amount of reading. The ground could fully prepare a person for, because these were not animals that fled when they were afraid. These were animals built across millions of years to do the opposite entirely. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an animal right before it decides not to run. Anyone who has spent real time around large wild animals will tell you it has a texture to it, a stillness that feels different from simple calm. The ears stop swiveling, the head lowers slightly, the weight shifts almost imperceptibly onto the hind legs. Hunters across thousands of generations learned to recognize this shift, because it meant something had changed in the animal's own private calculation, that fleeing no longer seemed like the better option, and standing to fight had begun to feel to that animal like the safer choice. This is the piece of the story that the earlier picture of the confident, knowledgeable hunter does not fully capture on its own. Yes, a skilled tracker could read the ground, predict a herd's movement, coordinate a drive across difficult terrain with other hunters he trusted. But all of that knowledge existed inside a landscape that was never simply a stage for human ambition. It was shared actively and dangerously with creatures that had their own claims on the same territory, the same prey, and occasionally the same patience for confrontation. Cave bears, for instance, are almost never given their proper weight in the popular imagination of this era, and it is worth pausing on them for a moment because the relationship between early humans and these enormous animals was far stranger and more layered than a simple predator and prey story. Some cave bears grew to sizes that dwarf the largest bears alive today, and they favoured the very same caves and rock shelters that human bands relied on for protection from weather and from other predators. This created a peculiar recurring situation across much of Ice Age Europe, where a band arriving at a promising shelter for the night might discover it was already occupied and not necessarily by another band of people. Excavations at cave sites across the continent have turned up bear remains in astonishing numbers, layered generation upon generation, in the same chambers alongside human tools and hearths that suggest these spaces were used abandoned and reused by both species across enormous stretches of time. Whether humans actively competed with cave bears for these shelters, avoided them during hibernation season, or occasionally hunted them deliberately. For their fat and hides remains a genuine subject of debate among researchers, since a cave floor can preserve bones far more easily than it can preserve the reasoning behind why they ended up there. What is easier to establish is that cave lions, a close and considerably larger relative of the lions that still exist today, very likely did view humans as viable prey, at least under the right circumstances. Ancient cave art discovered in parts of France depicts these animals with a level of anatomical accuracy that suggests the artists had studied them at extremely close range, close enough to notice details of musculature and posture that would be difficult to observe from any position of safety. It is a strange thing to consider that some of the most beautiful and carefully observed art from this entire era may have been created by people who had watched these animals not from a distance but from somewhere much closer, in moments when being seen back was a very real possibility. And then there is the matter of what predators actually thought of humans as prey. In the first place, a question that turns out to be more complicated than it first appears. For a very long stretch of prehistory, our ancestors were in the strictest sense not particularly dangerous animals to encounter. We lack the natural weapons that most successful predators rely on: no significant claws, no especially powerful bite, nothing resembling the raw physical advantage that a lion or a bear brings into any confrontation by default. What we had instead, and this took an enormous amount of time to develop into something reliable, was the ability to act together, to plan, and eventually to strike from a distance rather than at close range. Before that capability matured fully, it is worth sitting with the plain fact that early humans occupied a much more precarious position in the food chain than we tend to imagine, closer in some respects to prey than to apex predator. Fossilized remains bearing tooth marks from large cats and other predators have been found among early hominid remains in parts of Africa, a detail that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. Because we are so used to thinking of our own lineage as having always stood somewhere near the top of the natural order. For a very long time we did not. What changed this was not any single invention, but a slow accumulation of small advantages that eventually tipped the balance. Fire mattered enormously here, not simply for warmth or cooking, but because a maintained flame at the edge of a camp was one of the few things capable of reliably keeping large predators at a distance through the night when human eyesight is at its weakest and nearly every dangerous animal is at its best. The development of thrown weapons mattered just as much because it meant for the first time that a confrontation with a genuinely dangerous animal no longer had to happen at the range where its size and strength gave it every advantage. A spear thrown well was an argument made from a slightly safer distance. It did not eliminate danger. It simply changed its shape. Even with these advantages in place, direct confrontations with large predators never fully disappeared from the picture, and it would be dishonest to suggest they did. Wolves, though frequently smaller and more cautious around groups of humans than popular imagination, tends to assume still posed a genuine threat to anyone caught alone, injured or separated from their band, particularly during lean winters when a pack's own hunting had failed as often as the humans nearby. Hyenas in certain regions were bold enough to contest a kill directly with the hunters who had made it a confrontation that had nothing to do with predation in the traditional sense, and everything to do with two different species recognizing the same pile of meat as worth fighting over. Why would an animal risk injury over food it could in theory find elsewhere? The evidence suggests that for a hyena clan in a lean season, the calculation was often the same one facing the humans on the other side of that same kill site, that the risk of a fight was smaller than the risk of walking away with nothing. What this layered, contested landscape produced over an enormous span of time was something we still carry with us in ways that rarely get discussed. The particular alertness that makes a person glance instinctively toward a sudden movement at the edge of their vision, the discomfort many people feel being alone in true darkness, even when no rational threat is present, the deep, almost unreasonable relief of returning to a lit familiar space after dark. These are not modern anxieties invented by modern life. They are inherited responses shaped across hundreds of thousands of years by a world where the boundary between hunter and hunted was never as fixed or as comfortable as we might like to imagine. Our ancestors did not simply learn to hunt animals. They learned over an unimaginable stretch of time to survive being hunted themselves, and some quiet portion of that learning appears to have never entirely left us. It is against this backdrop, this shared and often dangerous landscape of predator and prey competition and coexistence that the largest and most consequential hunts of this era took place. Hunts aimed not at wolves or cave lions, but at animals so enormous that a single mistake in judgment carried consequences no amount of skill could fully guard against. Consider for a moment the sheer physical improbability of what we are about to describe. A creature standing taller than two grown men, weighing more than a dozen of them combined, covered in hair thick enough to withstand temperatures that would kill an unprotected human within hours, approached by a handful of people carrying nothing but sharpened wood and stone. And yet it happened not once, not rarely, but as a recurring, almost ordinary feature of life across an enormous stretch of the Ice Age world. Mammoths were not simply large. They were in the truest sense ecosystem engineers, animals whose daily movements shape the very landscape that other creatures, humans included, depended on to survive. A single adult mammoth could eat several 100 pounds of vegetation in a day, and the paths worn by migrating herds often became the paths that everything else in that landscape used as well. Predators, scavengers, and the human bands who had learned over countless generations to read those same paths like a map. To bring one down was to acquire an amount of meat, fat, hide, and bone that could sustain an entire band for weeks, sometimes longer once the marrow and rendered fat were properly stored. But the animal in front of you did not know any of that mattered. It knew only that something small and persistent was closing the distance, and mammoths, when sufficiently provoked or cornered, were entirely capable of turning that persistence into a very short, very final conversation. What tends to surprise people hearing this story for the first time is how rarely these hunts appear to have relied on direct confrontation at all. Archaeological sites across Europe, particularly certain locations in what is now Ukraine and the Czech Republic, have revealed something remarkable. The remains of dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bone tusks, arranged with a kind of structural intention that suggests these were not simply scavenged from animals that had died naturally, but gathered and used with real architectural purpose. Some researchers believe these bone structures represent evidence of large-scale hunting operations. Entire herds or significant portions of them brought down at once. Likely through the same kind of coordinated driving we described earlier, herds pushed toward terrain that did the killing more efficiently and more safely than any direct spear thrust ever could. Others argue that at least some of this bone was gathered from animals that had died of natural causes, perhaps trapped in mud or ice, and simply repurposed by resourceful bands who understood that a dead mammoth, however it came to be dead, represented an enormous and valuable resource either way. The truth very likely includes both possibilities, and scholars still debate the exact proportion of deliberate hunting versus scavenging represented in any single site. Since a bone pile can tell you an animal died there, but it cannot always tell you with certainty how. The giant bison of this era deserves its own quiet moment of attention here, because it is far less famous than the mammoth, despite having posed in some ways an even more immediate and frequent danger. These animals, larger by a significant margin than any bison alive today, moved in herds capable of turning en masse with a speed that gave a hunter caught in the wrong position almost no time to react. Unlike the mammoth, whose sheer size at least gave hunters a longer window to read its intentions and adjust their approach, a bison herd could shift from placid grazing to a full stampede in the space of a few heartbeats triggered by something as small as a sudden scent carried on the wrong current of wind. Kill sites associated with these animals found across parts of North America show evidence of exactly this kind of engineered stampede. Herds driven at speed toward natural traps, arroyos, narrow canyon mouths, places where the terrain itself became the primary weapon, and human hunters served more as directors of the animal's own momentum than as the ones delivering the final blow. It is a strange kind of hunting to picture one where the greatest skill was not strength or aim, but the ability to predict with real precision exactly how a frightened herd would move once it began to run and exactly where that fear could be steered. And this raises a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment. If the terrain itself was doing so much of the dangerous work, driving animals toward cliffs, bogs, narrow passages where their own momentum became fatal, why does the popular image of this era so often center on the lone hunter facing a beast in direct combat? Part of the answer is simply that direct close confrontation makes for a more vivid picture, easier to imagine and easier to draw, while a carefully coordinated drive across open ground, dozens of people working in silent, practiced unison is a harder story to tell in a single image. But the truth these kill sites reveal is in its own way more impressive than any single moment of individual bravery could be. It suggests a level of shared planning, communication, and trust between people that we do not always give this era enough credit for possessing. To successfully drive an enormous, frightened, and highly dangerous herd toward a specific point in the landscape required every single participant to understand their exact role and to trust that everyone else understood theirs as well. A single person moving too early or holding position too long out of fear could collapse the entire effort, sending the herd scattering in every direction except the one that mattered, and potentially directly toward the very people trying to guide it elsewhere. Even with the terrain doing much of the dangerous work, the moment of the kill itself, when it came at close range, remained exactly as perilous as it had always been. An animal driven into a bog or against a cliff edge did not simply lie down and accept what followed. Wounded, cornered, and terrified, these were often the most dangerous moments of the entire hunt, not the pursuit, but the final approach when hunters had to move in close enough to finish what the terrain had started against an animal whose fear had, if anything, made it more unpredictable rather than less. This is very likely where a significant portion of the injuries preserved in the skeletal record actually originated not from animals encountered in the open, but from these final close moments when the outcome seemed nearly decided, and the temptation to move in quickly before an opportunity slipped away outweighed the caution that had governed every earlier stage of the hunt. There is something worth holding on to here, something that connects this entire era back to the same quiet truth. We began this story with hunting against animals. Many times a human's size and strength was never simply about courage, and it was never simply about danger for its own sake. Every strategy these bands developed reading the ground, coordinating a drive, understanding exactly how a frightened herd would move, existed to manage a risk that could never be fully eliminated, only reduced, only made survivable one hunt at a time. The animals were not villains in this story any more than the hunters were. They were simply both of them doing everything they could to see the next season in a world that offered no guarantees to either side. It's worth pausing before we go further on how thin the line actually was between a hunt that ended in triumph and one that ended in tragedy, because the very same conditions that made these large hunts possible, the wind, the terrain, the herd's own fear, could just as easily turn against the people relying on them in ways no amount of planning could fully anticipate. The wind is the one variable no hunter, however skilled, ever fully mastered. Every other element of a hunt could be studied, anticipated, prepared for. The wind simply did what it wanted, and every hunter who ever lived carried a private understanding that all their skill rested in the end on this one uncontrollable thing behaving itself for just long enough. Late in a particular hunting season, somewhere on the open ground east of the great ice sheets that still covered much of the northern world, a band moves into position along a shallow ravine. They have been tracking a small herd of steppe bison for the better part of 2 days, patient in the way this work demanded, closing the distance slowly enough that the animals never registered the pursuit as a threat worth reacting to. The plan is a familiar one, refined over generations, hunters positioned along the ravine's edge, while a smaller group works to ease the herd gently, almost imperceptibly, toward the narrow point where the ground drops away sharply enough to do what spears alone could not. For most of the afternoon, everything unfolds exactly as it should. The herd drifts in the intended direction, unhurried, unaware. The hunters along the ravine hold their positions in absolute stillness, some of them crouched in the same posture for well over an hour, because a hunt like this one depended entirely on nobody moving a moment too soon, and then with no warning that any of them could have named after with the wind shifts. It is a small thing in the way that small things so often are, right up until the moment they are not. A current of air that had been carrying the hunter's scent safely away from the herd suddenly reverses, curling back across the open ground and directly into the herd's path. Bison possess a sense of smell considerably more acute than most people assume, capable of detecting a predator's presence from a distance that would surprise anyone who has not studied these animals closely. And within seconds the herd's entire posture changes. Heads lift, ears turn, and then all at once the herd does not move toward the ravine at all. It moves directly toward the line of hunters who had believed until that exact moment that they were the ones in control of where this animal was going. What happens next is the part of these stories that the physical record can only partially reconstruct, because a stampede leaves evidence of its outcome far more clearly than it leaves evidence of the seconds that produced it. We know from sites where this exact scenario appears to have played out that hunters caught in the direct path of a redirected herd faced a decision measured in a heartbeat or two, at most hold position, and hope the herd splits around them, or move and risk drawing the herd's attention directly toward the motion. Neither choice was safe. Both required the kind of nerve that no amount of practice fully prepares a person for, because practice, however extensive, never quite replicates the actual sound and weight of several tons of frightened animal closing distance at speed. Skeletal remains recovered from sites associated with bison hunts of this kind tell us something the narrative alone cannot. Fractures to the ribs, the pelvis and the long bones of the leg, appear with a consistency that researchers have connected specifically to blunt high-force impact injuries that align closely with what modern forensic studies of animal collisions would predict for a person struck by a running animal of this size. Some of these injuries show clear evidence of healing, meaning the person survived the encounter and lived long enough afterward for the bone to knit back together, sometimes imperfectly in ways that would have caused lingering pain and reduced mobility for the rest of that person's life. Others do not show healing at all, and it is these remains, quiet and unadorned as they are in the archaeological record, that tell us most plainly what a hunt turning against its hunters could actually cost. There is a detail here that rarely makes it into popular retellings of this era, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Analysis of certain Ice Age human remains has revealed injury patterns strikingly similar to those documented today among a very particular modern profession, professional rodeo performers, people whose work involves repeated close contact with large, powerful, frightened animals. The comparison was first proposed by researchers studying skeletal trauma in Neanderthal, remained specifically noting a strikingly high frequency of healed fractures concentrated in the head, neck,